The air in Cedar Ridge had the weight of something final. Dust hung like smoke above the main street, as if the land itself were holding its breath. And on the sun-washed steps of the courthouse, 5 sisters stood barefoot in torn dresses, each one of them a different shade of sorrow. They'd already sold 4. The crowd had come early, cowhands and drifters, merchants and gamblers, packed shoulder to shoulder like vultures waiting for the last heartbeat. The Texas sun poured down on them, unforgiving, golden, and cruel. They weren't here for land or horses. They were here for girls, daughters, lives. Next up, croaked the auctioneer, a wiry man with too much sweat on his neck and too little shame in his bones. The last of them Kinnan girls. Sarah May, 16. Strong hands, clean blood, good hips. Let's start at 20. The hammer hovered, waiting for the sound of a bid. But for a moment, there was only silence. Sarah May stood at the edge of that wooden platform, her deep crimson dress hanging off one shoulder, her auburn hair lit like flame in the sunlight. She wasn't crying. Not anymore. Her sisters had shed all the tears between them. Elizabeth, the eldest, had been sold first, like a prized mare, for $50 to a rancher with rough hands but decent eyes. She'd looked back once as they led her away, whispering, "Keep your chin high, Sarah." Mary Catherine followed, 19 and tender as spring wheat. A merchant bought her. His stare left bruises before he'd even touched her. Then the twins, Hannah and Rebecca, 18, sold as a pair to a man who owned a saloon 2 towns over. His laughter had the sound of spilled liquor and broken glass. Now only Sarah May remained. She didn't beg. She didn't flinch. But her bay toes curled against the splintered wood. Her green eyes, alive with fury, scanned the crowd, not for mercy. For an exit. She'd tried to run once, at 14. The desert nearly killed her. Her father dragged her back half-conscious from a dry creek bed, only to drink the last of their savings on the way home. And then came the debts. And then came this. 20, called a voice from the crowd, a ranch hand with tobacco-stained teeth. 25, barked another. The numbers rose, and Sarah's heart sank. Every new bid felt like a nail in the coffin of the girl she used to be. $1 more, and she became someone else's possession. She stared past them all, beyond the dusty men, beyond the wagons and the saloon porch, toward the wide horizon that promised everything she'd never tasted, freedom, dignity, something like love. And that's when she saw him. He stood near the edge of the crowd, just behind the hitching post where a black stallion waited, patient and still. He wasn't shouting, wasn't smiling, just watching, quiet as evening rain. Daniel O'Brien. They said he was a widower, that cholera took his wife and son the winter before last, that he kept mostly to himself, worked his land, came to town only when necessity demanded. But right now, he was stepping forward. The crowd parted like wheat in the wind as he moved, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black vest and white shirt, boots worn from years of miles. His face bore the quiet ruin of a man who'd lost too much and still carried it. And when he spoke, the whole square went still. 100. The auctioneer blinked. You say 100. Daniel nodded. $100. Gasps rippled through the crowd like thunder across the plains. But then came the real blow. He raised his voice, slow and firm, his eyes locked on Sarah May's. And her name. Whispers, murmurs. I'll take her, he said, as my wife, not my property. For a long moment, no one moved. Not the auctioneer, not the bidders, not even Sarah May. The crowd had never seen a man defy a system that profited off obedience. Daniel O'Brien's words hung there in the dry Texas air like a thunderclap, with no storm behind it. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. $100, auctioneer Pete Hawkins finally rasped, licking his lips. And, you offering marriage? I am, Daniel said. If she consents. That broke the spell. The crowd erupted, laughter from some, outrage from others. A few men cursed under their breath, angry they'd been outbid. Women in the back clutched their shawls tighter. Someone spat in the dust. "Now see here," O'Brien, Jake Morrison, one of the earlier bidders, growled. "This ain't a church service. This is an auction. You're not supposed to." "I know what it is," Daniel said sharply, his voice cutting through the grumbling like a blade. "And I know what she is. A girl. A daughter. Not a prize hog to be weighed and sold." Sarah May's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear. Was this real? A man she barely knew was offering her not just escape, but dignity? "Miss McKinnon," Daniel said, stepping closer now, his boots stirring the dust. "I don't expect you to know me. I only ask that you choose. Not be sold. Not be owned. Choose." The auctionee looked flustered, glancing back at the sheriff for direction. But Sheriff Tom Bradley, grizzled and gray, merely shrugged and scratched his beard. "If the girl consents," he muttered, "ain't no law says she can't accept." All eyes turned to Sarah. She had never been given the power to decide anything in her life. Not where she lived, not who touched her, not even what color dress she wore. But now, with the sun pouring gold on her skin and 100 strangers waiting, she realized something. They'd already taken everything from her. What else was left to lose? She began, her voice cracking. Then she looked into Daniel's face. Not pity, not possession. Just calm. Just presence. "I'll take your name," she said, "if you'll keep your word." Daniel nodded solemnly. "As God is my witness." The auctioneer hesitated, clearly unsure how to end a transaction that had become something more like a vow. "Well, if that's the agreement, then." "Sold. To Mr. Daniel O'Brien." The gavel struck wood. And just like that, Sarah May wasn't for sale anymore. Daniel climbed the steps and extended his hand. His fingers were rough, warm, and steady. She took it, and for the first time in months, her hands didn't tremble. Reverend Miller stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his white beard fluttering in the wind. "Mr. O'Brien," he said gently, "you'd like me to officiate?" "If you would," Daniel replied. "I don't want there to be any doubt." And so, in front of a stunned crowd, with no veil and no music and no flowers, just dust, sun, and silence, Sarah May McKinnon became Sarah May O'Brien. Reverend Miller read a brief passage from Corinthians. Sarah barely heard it. Her mind was spinning, not from fear, but from something new, something that tasted like freedom. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel didn't kiss her. He simply turned to her and said, "We'll leave as soon as you're ready." She nodded, still stunned. As he led her down the steps, the crowd slowly parted. A few men removed their hats. One woman whispered, "God bless them." But others stared coldly, disapproving of what they couldn't understand. A girl rescued, not claimed. Daniel helped her onto his horse, steadying her as she climbed. "It's 3 miles to my place," he said softly. "You'll have your own room, until or unless you decide otherwise." Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist as they rode out of town. The crowd behind them faded. The wind tugged at her hair. She closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she was going somewhere she had chosen. Somewhere that might, just might, become home. The prairie wind whispered through the grass as Daniel's horse carried them away from Cedar Ridge and away from everything Sarah May had ever known. Her arms stayed lightly around his waist, not in affection yet, but in growing trust. He didn't speak much on the ride, and she was grateful. Her mind was a storm of images, the raised gavel, her sister's tear-streaked faces, the bidding, the shame, and then, that voice cutting through the noise, "I'll take her as my wife, not my property." Those words would never leave her. It took over an hour to reach his land, but when they crested the final hill, the sight surprised her. The house was smaller than she expected. One story, made of weathered timber with a tin roof that glinted in the sun. But it was neat, sturdy, a place that had been cared for. A patch of garden peeked from behind the house. The fence was mended. There was even a porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. "It's not much," Daniel said, dismounting and then reaching to help her down, "but it's safe. And it's yours, too, if you want it." Sarah looked around. Compared to the dust and judgment of Cedar Ridge, this place felt like a chapel. He led her inside. The scent of cedar wood and old coffee lingered in the air. She noticed the way he moved, with quiet respect. He didn't watch her the way men at the auction had. He opened doors ahead of her, pointed things out, never once touched her without need. "This was the nursery," he said, stopping at the smallest room. "It's yours now, unless you'd prefer the larger one." "What happened to the baby?" she asked before she could stop herself. He didn't flinch. "James Patrick, born during the cholera outbreak, lived 3 days." A silence settled between them, the kind only shared by people who knew what it was to bury something they never got to keep. Later that evening, she stood on the porch in one of Catherine's old dresses, freshly washed and hanging loose on her thinner frame. She ran her hand along the wood of the railing, watching the last light fade from the horizon. Daniel joined her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He offered one to her wordlessly. She took it, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. "Tell me about her," Sarah said. He didn't hesitate. "Catherine had a laugh that made people stop in the street," he said. "She was plain-spoken, but she had a way of making everything feel less heavy. This place was her idea. She wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere our son could grow up knowing what peace sounded like." Sarah glanced at the porch swing, creaking softly in the breeze. "She would have liked you," he added. "The way you held your chin high, even when everyone was bidding like you weren't standing there." Sarah stared into the distance, heart aching from the day's events. "I was terrified." "That's what courage is," he said gently. "Being terrified, and standing anyway." Days passed, then weeks, and slowly, a rhythm settled in. Sarah May learned how to tend the garden. She milked the cow, gathered eggs, swept the porch each morning. She still slept in the small room, but it felt less like a cell and more like a place that had waited for her. Daniel worked the land, repairing fences, checking water troughs, riding into town once a week for supplies. He always asked if she wanted to come. She never did. Not yet. But what surprised her most was the laughter. One morning she spilled a bucket of feed, and Daniel chuckled. "You always declare war on breakfast." She smirked. "Only when it fights back." It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was becoming something. One evening, Sarah watched Daniel from the doorway as he sat on the porch after supper, whittling a scrap of wood into something she couldn't yet recognize. The wind moved his hair. His face was half shadow, half sunset. And she realized, this man had saved her, yes, but he'd never once reminded her of it. He wasn't a hero with grand speeches or sweeping gestures. He was steady, he was kind, and he was giving her the one thing no man had ever offered: time. She stepped onto the porch, sat beside him. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned the half-carved wood toward her. It was the shape of a horse, not perfect, but detailed enough to recognize. "For the nursery," he said. "Thought it was time it had something new." Sarah felt something stir deep inside her. Hope. Maybe tomorrow, she'd ask to go into town. Maybe next week, she'd ride her own horse. Maybe soon, she'd ask him about the swing on the porch, and whether he might sit beside her just to watch the sun go down. The wind carried the scent of autumn, dry grass, warm earth, and the faintest trace of smoke from a neighbor's chimney 2 miles away. Sarah May was beginning to hum again as she worked. It wasn't a melody she knew, just something she made up as she harvested carrots from the garden. Her hands were dirty, her sleeves rolled up, and her braid kept falling loose from under her scarf. But she didn't mind. In fact, she felt content. When Daniel returned from town that afternoon, she was hanging clothes on the line. He handed her a small envelope. Her name, Sarah May McKinnon, was scribbled in a familiar hand. Her breath caught. "It came through the preacher," Daniel said gently. "From Elizabeth." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. The writing was shaky, the ink faded in places, but the words struck like thunder. Mary Catherine tried to run. The merchant beat her knee to death. The twins, they are still with that saloon owner. I'm safe, but I don't know how much longer I can stay silent. Please, if you're alive, do something. Sarah sat down hard on the porch step, the letter falling into her lap. Daniel waited. He didn't push her. Just sat beside her, quiet and steady as always. "They are suffering," she whispered. "My sisters, they are being treated like animals. I have to help them. Daniel, I have to." He looked at her then, not surprised, not reluctant, just calm. "Then we help them," he said simply. She turned to him, eyes searching. "Even if it's dangerous?" "Yes. Even if it costs everything." He nodded once. "Sarah May, you're my wife. That makes them my family, too." Her chest swelled with emotion so fast it hurt. Not just gratitude, something deeper, something she didn't have a name for yet. That night, she packed what little she had. Daniel did the same, without hesitation. He mapped a route, gathered supplies, and saddled 2 horses. By morning, they were riding out. Sarah had never ridden on her own before. Daniel rode slowly beside her, teaching her the reins, how to sit steady, how to move with the mare beneath her. "You're doing fine," he said softly, after she almost slipped. "No, I'm not." "Doesn't matter. You're still trying." That night they made camp near the edge of a creek. Under a sky full of stars, Sarah sat beside the fire, reading Elizabeth's letter again and again. Her jaw clenched tighter each time. "I won't lose them," she said at last. "I couldn't save them before, but I will now." Daniel nodded, tending the fire. "We'll start with Mary Catherine. She's closest. Then we'll find the twins." Sarah watched the flames flicker in his eyes. She had once been sold for $50, but this man, this quiet, grieving widower, was spending everything to give her sisters a second chance. And for the first time, she believed she might just be worth it. Millerville was a half-day's ride from their last camp, but it felt like another world. The sun was high when Sarah May and Daniel arrived, dust clinging to their boots and sweat lining their brows. It was a small, grimy town. 1 saloon, 1 general store, and too many narrow eyes watching from porches and windows. Sarah scanned the buildings until she found the one described in Elizabeth's letter, a plain, flat-roofed structure with a faded sign reading Prescott Mercantile. Her sister was supposed to be living in a room above it. "She'll be there," Daniel said. "But you need to be prepared." Sarah May nodded, steeling herself. She had imagined this reunion 100 times, her arms around Mary Catherine, laughter, tears, hope. But now, standing here, she felt only fire. If that merchant had laid a hand on her sister again. Mary Catherine appeared on the wooden porch just as they reached the store. She was sweeping, slowly, gingerly, like every muscle in her body ached. Her green dress hung loose on her frame, and dark bruises marked the delicate skin of her arms. But it was her face that undid Sarah May. The moment their eyes met, the broom slipped from Mary Catherine's hands. She blinked as if disbelieving the sight before her. "Sarah," she whispered. Sarah leapt off the horse, ran across the street, and caught her sister in her arms. Mary Catherine clung to her like a lifeline, sobbing quietly against her shoulder. "I thought you were gone," she choked out. "I thought I'd die here." "No," Sarah said fiercely. "Not you. Not anymore." Inside the store, a thin, Angular man with slicked-back hair and hard eyes had begun to watch them through the window. He stepped outside, chewing on a toothpick. "Hey now," he called, swaggering down the steps. "That girl belongs to me. Paid good money for her." Daniel stepped forward without hesitation, placing himself between the sisters and the man. "I'll buy out her contract," he said evenly. "Name your price." The merchant snorted. "She ain't for sale. I got work for her still." "You mean beatings and bruises?" Daniel's tone turned to steel. "Half the town's seen it. You want the sheriff brought into this." The crowd gathering behind them grew silent. The man wavered. $50. Daniel didn't blink. "Done." Mary Catherine gasped. "Daniel, that's—" He raised a hand gently. "Doesn't matter. You're coming with us." Prescott spat into the date, then turned and stormed back inside. That night, Mary Catherine lay on a blanket near the fire, curled up beside Sarah May like when they were children. "I thought no one would ever come for me," she whispered. "I prayed, but after a while, I stopped hoping." Sarah brushed the hair back from her sister's face. "Well, I didn't. I never stopped." Nearby, Daniel watched over them both, a rifle across his lap and the fire casting gold across his face. One sister free. 2 more to go. And Sarah May was just getting started. Dusty Creek lived up to its name, a low, wind-blown town with more saloons than churches and the kind of silence that clung to your boots. The buildings leaned like old drunks, and the streets hummed with the kind of danger Daniel could smell a mile away. They arrived just after noon, with Mary Catherine bundled beneath a shawl to hide the bruises she still wore like fading shadows. Daniel had insisted she come only if she was strong enough, and she had insisted she couldn't stay behind. "My sisters need me," she'd said. "You saved me, but I won't be saved alone." Now, from the upper floor of the only respectable boarding house in town, they stared across the street at the saloon called the Silverthorn. Music leaked through its broken shutters. Laughter, sharp and cruel. And above it all, a balcony where 2 young women stood like ghosts behind a locked railing. Hannah and Rebecca. Sarah May's breath hitched the moment she saw them. Both were thinner than she remembered, paler. Rebecca leaned into the shadows, while Hannah watched the street with the distant gaze of someone who'd seen too much. Daniel followed her gaze, then lowered the curtain. "We can't go in shooting. Snake Morrison's got hired men. And the sheriff here paid to look away." "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We wait. Watch. Find a crack." The crack came 2 nights later. Daniel had noticed a pattern. Every Tuesday, Snake Morrison left the saloon just before noon, riding to the edge of town for business. He took 2 of his toughest men with him. That left the bar guarded by 1 surly bartender and a few lazy hangers-on too drunk to shoot straight. "We'll move then," Daniel said. "But the girls are locked upstairs," Mary Catherine reminded him. "I can pick a lock," Sarah May said, surprising them both. "Daddy used to keep our food locked up when he drank too much. I learned." Daniel's eyes softened. "You're something else." Tuesday came like thunder on the horizon. At exactly 11:45, Snake Morrison rode out of town. Mary Catherine played her part again, stumbling dramatically in front of the saloon, drawing attention. The bartender rushed out to help, swearing and waving for someone to fetch water. Daniel and Sarah slipped in through the rear. The whole upstairs stank of whiskey and sweat. Daniel checked each door as they passed, his pistol steady in his hand. Finally, at the end of the hall, they found a padlocked room. From inside, soft voices. "Rebecca," Sarah whispered. "It's me. It's Sarah." Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "No," came Hannah's voice. "That's not funny. That's not fair. It's really me. I've come to take you home." The key Daniel had swiped didn't work, so Sarah knelt and worked with a small hairpin. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but fury. fury at a world that put chains on girls and called it justice. The lock clicked. The door opened. Rebecca rushed into her arms, sobbing, while Hannah stood frozen in place. "You're not real," she whispered. "I dream about you. All the time." Sarah took her hands. "Then let's make this dream end different." They hurried down the stairs just as shouts rose from the street. "Morrison's back," Daniel said. They bolted out the rear, where their horses were tied. But as they mounted, hoofbeats thundered from the edge of town. "Snake Morrison and his men. Go!" Daniel shouted, leading them into the desert. The chase was wild, bullets cracking through dry air, dust blinding. Sarah clung to Rebecca, while Mary Catherine leaned hard against Hannah behind her. Daniel's voice rang out steady as he led them through scrub and brush. Just as hope began to falter, salvation arrived. A patrol of soldiers from Fort Davis rode up, their lieutenant raising a hand to stop the chaos. Morrison blustered, waving papers, yelling about stolen property. "Where's your proof these girls are yours?" the officer asked. Morrison hesitated. "Just like I thought," the lieutenant said. "Step aside." Morrison sneered but retreated. He knew better than to challenge rifles backed by government seals. Later that night, around a fire miles from Dusty Creek, Sarah held all four of her sisters. No one spoke for a long time. There was only the crackle of the flames and the weight of what they'd survived. "You came," Hannah said finally. "I told you I would," Sarah whispered. And she had, because love, when fed by fire and fury, is stronger than any chain. The ride home took longer than expected, not because the trails were rougher or the horses slower, but because no one wanted to rush it. Freedom, once earned, deserved to be felt. It clung to their skin like prairie dust and settled in the soft moments between words. Hannah sang softly sometimes, half to herself. Rebecca stared at everything, trees, clouds, sun, as though she was seeing the world for the first time. Mary Catherine, though still healing, kept the others laughing with stories from childhood, her voice regaining the strength cruelty had stolen. And Sarah May rode at the center of it all, her heart full, tired, yes, but more alive than ever before. Daniel watched her more than she knew. He didn't speak much on the trail, but he noticed every shift of her shoulders, every flicker of emotion on her face. His respect for her had already been deep. Now it was rooted like an oak, immovable and growing. They reached the ranch just after sunrise on the fourth morning. The cabin stood quiet in the golden light, as if holding its breath. It had been built for a family Daniel once lost. It now welcomed the one he'd chosen. As they dismounted, Sarah May whispered, "We're home." The word trembled from her lips like a hymn. Inside, they moved slowly, reverently. The rooms were warm from the sun that had poured through the windows all week. Flowers bloomed in a jar on the table, left by Daniel before they left. It was a house prepared with hope. Daniel turned to the girls. "It's yours now, all of you. This place, this is your home." The next few days were a blur of settling in. Beds were made, cupboards filled, and clothing washed in hot water until every stitch felt like a new beginning. Mary Catherine took over the kitchen first, declaring, "If I'm to live here, no one's going hungry." She cooked simple meals, full of warmth. Hannah found herself drawn to the horses, brushing them every morning, speaking to them as though they were old friends. Rebecca asked for sewing supplies and began mending the worn dresses the girls had brought with them. The needle in her hands became a symbol of repair, of healing, of quiet strength. Sarah May organized everything. She kept the household humming, checking in on each sister, planning meals, even planting early seeds in the garden again. But her heart pulled toward Daniel more with each day. Every night they sat together on the porch, watching the sky deepen from gold to indigo. At first, their hands rested close, but not touching. Eventually, Sarah reached for his, and Daniel closed his fingers gently around hers. They said little. The silence between them had become a comfort. One evening, she asked, "Do you ever think about what might have been if Catherine and your boy had lived?" Daniel was quiet a long time before answering. "I used to. Every day. But lately, I think more about what is. What we're building. I'll never forget them. But I don't want to miss what's in front of me either." Sarah May looked out over the prairie. "This isn't the life I thought I'd have, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." That night, as the others drifted to sleep, Sarah stood alone in the garden, hands in the soil. She whispered a prayer of thanks to the stars, for second chances, for Daniel, for the wind that still carried her mother's voice when the night was quiet enough. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived. Her visit had been planned weeks before, but the timing felt like fate. She rode in with her husband, a kind, soft-spoken rancher named Benjamin, and when she saw her sisters alive, whole, and free, she burst into tears. They gathered under the old oak tree near the barn. All 5 McKinnon girls, arms wrapped around each other. They laughed. They cried. They remembered. And then, something new happened. Daniel emerged from the house holding a small, wooden frame. Inside it was a simple sketch, rough but heartfelt. 5 women standing hand in hand, drawn from memory. "I thought it might belong here," he said, placing it gently on the mantel. Sarah May took his hand, and for the first time since Cedar Ridge burned beneath her bare feet, she felt something fierce and unfamiliar. Joy. Autumn came to Cedar Ridge like a whisper. Soft winds, golden skies, and the scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. At the O'Brien Ranch, it brought a stillness that felt earned. For the first time in over a year, there were no urgent rides, no terrifying escapes, no goodbyes whispered in fear. The house was full, and more than that, it was full of life. Each day had its rhythm. Mornings began with fresh bread and laughter in the kitchen. Midday brought the chorus of chores, laundry snapping on the line, horses shod and watered, vegetables pulled from the earth. At night, the house glowed with lamplight and the low murmur of conversation or song. Sarah May watched it all, the flicker of peace, the soft rewinding of time, and felt something building inside her that she hadn't yet named. A question, a hope, a trembling breath that never seemed to fully exhale. Daniel, too, had grown quieter in recent weeks, though not distant. His glances lingered longer. His footsteps slowed near wherever Sarah stood. When their hands brushed, he no longer pulled away first. But there was something between them. Not hesitation, but a pause. A space waiting to be filled. It came, as these moments often do, not in silence but in disaster. The fire began in the barn. It was early evening. A lantern had tipped while Rebecca searched for twine. A flash, a crackle, and suddenly the old dry hay roared to life. Sarah was the first to hear the screams. She sprinted barefoot across the yard, Daniel behind her. Mary Catherine grabbed buckets. Hannah raced for the pump. The flames licked the roof of the barn in minutes, and the horses inside kicked in panic. Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran straight into the smoke. Sarah followed. The world inside the barn was chaos, heat like a furnace, smoke like blindness. Daniel shouted over the crackling timbers as he cut the ropes on the horses' stalls. Sarah, choking, grabbed the nearest reins and pulled a terrified mare into the open. One by one they led the animals out. Then, a crack, a flash of flame, and part of the roof collapsed. Daniel barely dove out in time, landing hard on his side. Sarah screamed and ran to him, hands trembling as she touched his face. "I'm fine," he gasped, coughing. "You're all right." She nodded, the breath finally shaking out of her lungs. They sat in the dirt long after the flames had been beaten back. The barn was lost, but the animals were safe, and no one was hurt beyond singed hair and bruised ribs. In the quiet that followed, Sarah turned to Daniel. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, finally, placed a hand to her cheek. I've been scared of asking for too much, he said softly. You were never mine to take. I just wanted to keep you safe. But Sarah May, his voice caught. I love you. Her breath caught. I've loved you since the day you stood on that platform like a flame refusing to go out. I just didn't want to chain you to me. You didn't chain me, she whispered. You saved me, and then you let me walk beside you. That's all I ever wanted. Daniel exhaled. Then I need to ask. She stilled. Not as a contract, not as repayment, but as a man asking the woman he loves. Will you marry me, properly, this time? No auction, no crowd, just you and me, and a promise made for love. Sarah May smiled, not with her lips, but her whole face, her whole heart. Yes, she said. I thought you'd never ask. That night, under a sky washed clean by ash and stars, they stood hand in hand beneath the oak tree and planned a wedding. A real one. One built not from rescue, but from choice. And in the shadows, her sisters watched, not as children in need of saving, but as women who had been saved, and smiled. The O'Brien ranch buzzed with gentle excitement. News of the upcoming wedding, a real wedding, had spread quietly among the family, though Daniel and Sarah May asked for no town-wide fanfare. They wanted something small, something honest, something that belonged to them. The ceremony would take place under the sprawling oak tree near the back of the property, the same tree Sarah May often sat beneath to read aloud, and the same one where Daniel had first dared to dream of happiness again. The sisters helped string wildflowers between branches. Mary Catherine hemmed a new dress from fabric Elizabeth had brought on her last visit. It was soft cream with simple lace, and when Sarah May tried it on, even she was stunned into silence. It wasn't fancy, but it felt sacred. I feel like a woman, she whispered, smoothing the skirt. Not a burden. Not a survivor. Just myself. Mary Catherine wrapped her arms around her. That's exactly what you are. And you deserve every joy that's coming. Meanwhile, Daniel stood with Reverend Miller, sanding a new bench to place beneath the tree. It would be where they exchanged their vows. He didn't speak much, but his eyes sparkled with a kind of quiet peace no one had seen in him since the death of Catherine and little James. Think she'd be proud of me, Reverend? He asked softly. Reverend Miller gave a gentle smile. Proud? Daniel. She'd be dancing in the heavens. You've honored her memory. But more than that, you've dared to love again. That's something many men never find the courage to do. The morning of the ceremony arrived with gold mist and stillness. The 5 sisters moved through the house in a kind of dream. Rebecca combed Sarah May's hair, braiding small wildflowers into the loose waves. Hannah helped her into the dress. Elizabeth brought a delicate string of pearls she once wore at her own wedding and fastened it around Sarah's neck. Outside, Daniel stood beneath the oak, freshly shaven, wearing a crisp white shirt and dark vest. His hands trembled only once, when he saw her walking across the yard. There was no music, no grand audience, only wind through the branches and the soft murmur of family gathered in a circle. Reverend Miller spoke plainly, warmly. Daniel O'Brien, he said, do you take this woman, not out of duty or desperation, but out of love freely chosen, to be your wife? Daniel smiled, tears in his eyes. I do, with all I am. And Sarah May, do you take this man, not as your rescuer, but as your partner, your equal in all things? I do, she whispered, and I choose him. The kiss that followed was gentle, almost reverent. Around them, the sisters clapped, laughter spilling into the sky. And in that moment, with dust in the wind and hope in the air, the girl who had once been auctioned stood tall, not claimed, not rescued, but chosen. Seasons turned. Snow came and melted. The fields of Cedar Ridge bloomed again. Sarah May stood on the porch with one hand resting on her round belly, the other laced with Daniel's. The ranch behind them was alive with laughter and voices, the sisters tending gardens, sewing, reading. Hannah brushed a mare. Mary Catherine read aloud to a visiting neighbor. Elizabeth rocked her newborn beside Rebecca, who was finally writing the book she'd always dreamed of. But Sarah May wasn't watching them. She was looking out toward the road, the same road she had once imagined escaping down. "I still remember the sound of that hammer," she said quietly. Daniel squeezed her hand. "And I remember the silence right after." They didn't need to say more. They both knew what had changed everything. Not just the bid. Not just the rescue. It was the choice. His and hers. That night, by firelight, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "If it's a girl, what will we call her?" Sarah smiled, eyes gleaming. "Hope," she said. And so the story that began on dusty courthouse steps ended where every great Western ought to, with family, freedom, and the promise of a tomorrow born from love, not fear. They tried to sell her like cattle. He offered her a name instead. What began with shame ended in sunrise. On land they healed, with love they built. The girl once auctioned stood taller than history, not as someone's property, but as someone's choice. And in the quiet of twilight, when her son asked how it all began, she smiled and said, "It began when one man listened." If this story stirred something in you, if you believe in voices long silenced being finally heard, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe to Ironwood Narratives, where every tale dares to speak truth, no matter how buried. Here, we give the forgotten a voice, the broken a home, and justice a second chance. Tap the bell, not just for another upload, but for another soul waiting to be seen. This isn't just a channel, it's a reckoning. Welcome to Ironwood Narratives.